Hello and welcome. Today we will be discussing human-made disaster response, specifically that to a chlorine gas release after railroad derailment. The objectives for today's lessons are to define a human-made disaster, describe the potential impact of a chlorine gas leak after a railroad derailment, identify the effects of this hazardous materials incident on the community at large, explain the major components of an operational plan, recognize potential issues that may occur during a large-scale hazardous materials incident, discuss strategies to increase preparedness, review mitigation strategies to decrease incident severity, and then summarize the communication strategies to support incident safety for all parties involved. So what is a human-made disaster? A human-made disaster is any large-scale emergency caused by human actions, negligence, intentional actions, equipment, or structural failures. Some examples of human-made disasters are hazardous materials spills, industrial explosions, transportation accidents, chemical releases, and structural failure of infrastructure. These incidents often require a rapid deployment of multiple agencies to conduct a complex response to restore services, protect life safety, and support disaster recovery. Chlorine gas is widely transported by railcar throughout the United States. A single tanker can transport approximately 90 tons of compressed liquefied chlorine gas. A derailment involving a tanker carrying chlorine gas can rapidly turn into a regional disaster that requires evacuations, shelter-in-place orders, and the deployment of significant amounts of medical personnel for patient care and treatment purposes. The potential scale of a chlorine gas leak from a rail tanker could be a mass casualty incident involving respiratory injuries, fatalities, environmental contamination, road closures, hospital surges, long-term disruptions to the local economy, and post-traumatic stress to the residents and providers. Even a small leak can affect thousands of people depending on weather conditions and population density. The initial actions in zone of isolation is 3,000 feet in all directions from the leaking container, with mandatory evacuations in that area, and a requirement for all responders to be outfitted in full chemical protective suits and self-contained breathing apparatus. The protective zone will increase based on the size of the spill, time of day, and wind direction, expanding to over 6 miles. All of these factors and considerations may rapidly overcome locally available emergency services with patients experiencing respiratory illnesses. Chlorine gas irritates the eyes and skin. It can cause severe respiratory distress, pulmonary edema, and respiratory failure. It is particularly dangerous for children, older adults, and people who already have respiratory problems. EMS providers need to recognize the early signs of exposure, including coughing, wheezing, stridor, burning eyes, and respiratory distress. Severe exposures require rapid and potentially aggressive airway management and oxygen therapy. A clearly established and routinely practiced incident command system ensures that resources are available and coordinated appropriately while maintaining responder safety and fiscal responsibility. ICS should be activated immediately. Unified command should be adopted from the onset of this human-made disaster, with the additions of an EMS branch, hazardous materials teams, additional law enforcement assistance, and specially trained and outfitted fire suppression teams. A safety officer is necessary to oversee the event, maintain operational safety, and ensure that safety is never compromised. A public information officer should routinely share updates with the public in an effort to keep the populace abreast of the situation and calm. Responder safety is the number one priority for all responders on scene. EMS personnel should never enter a contaminated scene or area without appropriate training, personal protective equipment, and support from hazardous materials responders. With scene safety being assessed initially and continuously throughout the response, the hazard must then be identified, in this case, chlorine gas. A hot, warm, and cold zone must be established. Triage of patients using the department's choice of start triage must be accomplished, next to determine the number of expected patients. Hospitals need to be notified of the large-scale event so they can begin to ready themselves for patient arrival. And decontamination, airway management, along with ongoing patient care and rapid transport need to be initiated as directed by Incident Command and the Transportation Chief. Many of these priorities will be accomplished simultaneously. However, scene safety must remain in the forefront of everyone's mind. You can't help anyone if you make yourself a patient. Disasters tend to reveal system weaknesses in communications, interagency operability, resource management, allocation, and availability, hospital and decontamination capacity issues, provider fatigue, and public panic. The way to combat most of these problems are to regularly hold and participate in exercises to identify and rectify these issues prior to an event. Environmental hurdles are difficult to account for as weather and wind direction can change at any time, so identifying and choosing appropriate command locations near potential disaster threats ahead of time is imperative. The only way a disaster can be managed successfully is with pre-planning. Resiliency is built by strengthening relationships among disaster responders, hospitals, schools, and community leaders before a disaster occurs. A hazard vulnerability assessment is a good beginning to this. However, mutual aid agreements, joint exercises, public education, stakeholder review of emergency plans, railroad coordination, and a functional emergency alert system must be included in pre-planning efforts. The best way to respond to a disaster is to prevent it when possible, and when impossible, to limit the negative impact where practical. This can be accomplished with engineering controls, including railroad monitoring, inspections and hazardous materials routing, training for responders and the public to include emergency drills, evacuation route marking, and advanced hazardous material training for disaster responders. Lastly, plans must include all possible stakeholders as well as a stockpiling of personal protective equipment and medical supplies. During an event, accurate and timely information both reduces public panic and improves compliance with unified command directives. Official communications should be delivered by the public information officer only and only come from the incident commander. It can be delivered in a multitude of ways, including the emergency alert system, social media, wireless messaging, and coordination with regional dispatch communication centers. However, after containment has been achieved and recovery has begun, the Public Health Department should communicate with the public on health updates and environmental testing results. Agencies involved with the disaster should conduct a coordinated after-action review to plan improvements. Recovery efforts and available ongoing resources should be communicated to the public regularly. No agency can manage any large-scale disaster alone, and no human-made disaster response goes perfectly. Knowing these facts, constantly training and educating staff, preparing for disasters ahead of time, using effective communication, the incident command system, Fostering interagency relationships and educating the community are all necessary steps to take. Once these tasks have been addressed, the largest of them all is the next order of business, and that is to constantly evaluate your plans and performance to ensure continued improvement. Human-made disasters often occur without warning. Accidental release of chlorine gas presents a significant challenge for EMS and fire department personnel. Planning, training, and mitigation strategies, along with effective communication, can often reduce injury, decrease the disaster impact, and ultimately save lives. Disaster response success or failure begins long before the disaster occurs, and being appropriately prepared through training, collaboration, and planning strengthens our department and our community's ability to recover.